Avery Thorn was not one to believe in ghosts. She had spent her life scoffing at the tales her grandmother would spin by the fire, brushing off the whispers of haunted woods and cursed homes. But the letter that arrived on her doorstep was unlike anything she'd ever encountered. It was written in an ink that seemed to shimmer between black and crimson, as though it couldn't decide whether it wanted to bleed or burn. The envelope smelled faintly of soil and something else, something metallic. It bore no return address, only her name written in an elegant, looping script. Inside, the letter read, "Miss Thorn, you have been selected. A room has been prepared for you at 36 Whitlock Lane. Arrive before midnight. Failure to comply will result in consequences. Sincerely, the curator." Avery snorted at first, dismissing the letter as an elaborate prank. But as the evening wore on, the feeling of being watched crept into her apartment. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, and faint whispers crawled along the edges of her hearing. By the time the clock struck 11:30, she was in her car, the letter clenched in her trembling hand. 36 Whitlock Lane was a monstrosity of a building. It loomed against the night sky, its crooked silhouette outlined by the pale glow of a crescent moon. The house seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing in the cold winter air. The door creaked open before she could knock. A gust of warm, foul-smelling air greeted her, carrying the scent of decay and damp wood. A faint, almost musical hum seemed to emanate from deep within. "Welcome," said a voice from the shadows. A man stepped forward, clad in an impeccable black suit. His face was sharp, almost unnaturally so, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. "You must be the curator," Avery said, her voice betraying her unease. "Indeed," he replied, bowing slightly. "The others are waiting." "Others? All will be explained in time," he said, motioning for her to follow. The interior of the house was worse than she had imagined. The walls were adorned with paintings that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, their subjects' eyes following her every move. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and each step seemed to echo far longer than it should. The dining room was a cavernous space, its centerpiece a massive table carved from what looked like blackened bone. Around it sat 6 other guests, each looking as out of place as she felt. There was a man in his 60s, his face lined with scars that told stories of battles he'd never share. Beside him sat a woman in a pristine lab coat, her hands trembling as she clutched a leather-bound notebook. A teenager with dyed green hair and a nervous smile sat next to a stoic man in military fatigues. The final 2 were twins, their identical faces eerily devoid of emotion. The curator took his place at the head of the table, clapping his hands once. The sound reverberated unnaturally, silencing the low murmurs. "Welcome, my chosen," he said, his voice carrying an almost hypnotic cadence. "Tonight, you will partake in an experience unlike any other." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. "Each of you has been invited because you carry within you a darkness," the curator continued, "a stain upon your soul that binds you to this place. Tonight, you will face that darkness." One by one, the guests were led to separate doors, each marked with a unique symbol. Avery's door bore a handprint, its fingers unnaturally long and slender. The curator handed her a key, his touch cold as ice. "What's behind the door?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your truth," he replied, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The key turned with a satisfying click, and the door swung open to reveal a room bathed in an eerie, pulsating red light. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if alive. The air inside was thick with the scent of blood and something sweet, almost cloying. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound was deafening, and when she turned, the door was gone. In its place was a smooth, seamless wall. "Welcome, Avery," a voice whispered, low and guttural. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The room began to shift, the walls warping and twisting until they formed a grotesque tableau. It was her childhood bedroom, but wrong. The furniture was too large, the shadows too deep. Her reflection in the cracked mirror was not her own, but a twisted, skeletal version of herself. "Do you remember?" the voice asked. "Remember what?" Avery demanded, her heart pounding. The room answered with a scene that unfolded before her eyes. It was the night she had buried the truth, the night she had hidden the body of the man who had tried to destroy her life. The guilt she had buried deep within her chest clawed its way to the surface, threatening to consume her. The skeletal reflection stepped out of the mirror, its bony fingers reaching for her. "You cannot escape yourself," it hissed. The ordeal seemed to last for hours, each moment dragging her deeper into a pit of despair and self-loathing. But as the reflection's hand touched her chest, a surge of defiance rose within her. She screamed, a sound that tore through the oppressive air, shattering the mirror and plunging the room into darkness. When the lights returned, she was back in the dining room. The other guests were there as well, each looking as though they had aged decades in the span of a few hours. The curator stood at the head of the table, his smile wider than ever. "Congratulations," he said. "You have survived." "What was the point of all this?" Avery demanded, her voice hoarse. "The room feeds on darkness," he replied, "and in return it offers clarity." "Clarity?" she scoffed. "That was hell." "Perhaps," the curator said, his eyes gleaming. "But now, you are free." As the guests filed out of the house, Avery felt the weight of her past lifted, replaced by a strange emptiness. She knew she would never forget what she had seen, but she also knew she would never be the same. And as she walked away from 36 Whitlock Lane, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting for its next meal.